But I expect you gathered that chapter 3 of Lamentations was the inspiration for Thomas Chisholm to write the hymn Great Is Thy Faithfulness. He lived a pretty ordinary life, and because of ill health, ended his days in the Methodist home for the elderly in New Jersey. He wrote, "My income has not been large at any time due to impaired health in the earlier years, which has followed me on until now. Although I must not fail to record here the unfailing faithfulness of a covenant-keeping God, and that he has given me many wonderful displays of his providing care, for which I am filled with astonishing gratefulness." Reading Lamentations made him realise that God is at work in our lives on a daily basis, not only in dramatic or miraculous ways, but also in simple, everyday ways. As we heard last week, Lamentations contains a whole series of laments concerning the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. We read of the unspeakable horrors of starvation and cruelty that the people suffered in the siege leading up to the capture of the city. Then once the Babylonians took the city, they ruthlessly killed many of the people. They took the strongest and best of the survivors and marched them off as slaves into exile. They ransacked the temple. They broke down the city walls. They left the streets and houses in ruins. Everything was stripped away, and the Israelites suffered immense loss. What was even worse, the Israelites had brought all this on themselves. They had rebelled against God and defied his commands, and so they were in a large part responsible for the losses that they had suffered. Lamentations was written in the aftermath of all this incredible sorrow and loss. So what do we do when faced with sorrow and loss in our lives? How do we keep from sinking down under it all? How do we keep the sorrow and troubles of the past from poisoning the present and obscuring the future? How do we find the hope to carry on? And that's what we look to in Lamentations this morning. In chapter 3, verses 19 to 21, the author remembers all the sorrows that Israel had recently experienced. The more he dwells on these sorrows, the more sorrowful he becomes. Dwelling on our sorrow will only increase our sorrow. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't express our sorrow. When we experience any kind of loss in our lives, it's good and it's right for us to express sorrow over the loss. Sometimes as believers we feel this pressure to put on a happy face and pretend that everything is okay when it's not. And that's not right, because it isn't honest. Read Paul's letters in the New Testament. Paul didn't mind sharing his struggles with others. Then there are other people who advocate being stoic, not expressing any emotion at all during times of loss. Being stoic says, just rein yourself into your fate. Don't get upset, don't complain. Simply accept whatever comes your way without any emotional response at all. Well, as Christians, we don't believe in fate. We believe in God, which is completely different. God teaches us throughout the Bible that we may and we should express our sorrow during times of trouble. Lamentations is a divinely inspired book expressing sorrow during a time of great loss. In the Psalms, you'll find one example after another of people pouring out their hurts and frustrations and disappointments before the Lord in prayer. Paul in Romans 12 tells us, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. And look at the example of Jesus himself. In John 11, Jesus wept and expressed his own personal sorrow at the death of his friend Lazarus. So it's good and it's right for us to express our sorrow. God gave us tear ducts for a reason. We should cry when we need to, talk about it, pray about it, talk to a friend, draw a picture, write a poem or a song. Whatever it takes, express your sorrow and grief let it out. We're not talking about not expressing our sorrow here. We're talking about not dwelling on our sorrow. Expressing sorrow is healthy. Dwelling on our sorrow is not. Dwelling on our sorrow will poison our lives with bitterness. Verse 19, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. The writer is dealing with memories. He uses 4 words to describe those memories: affliction, wandering, bitterness, and gall. The word for affliction can be translated trouble or misery. The word for wandering refers to restlessness or straying. The word for bitterness is the word for the poison wormwood or hemlock. And the word for gall refers to a bitter or poisonous herb. So what is going on in verse 19? Well, the writer is remembering all of his troubles, all of his miseries. He remembers his wanderings, his straying from the Lord. He is partly responsible for his troubles. And so he's probably struggling with guilt here as well. The memories just keep crashing in. Bitter memories poison our lives, and they poison our relationships. They poison our relationship with God, with our family, and with each other. Dwelling on our sorrow eventually leads to depression and despair. Verse 20, I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. In Hebrew, the phrase, I will remember them, is actually the word remember used twice. I remember them. Well, some of us are so good at remembering the negatives in our lives, we don't just remember them, we remember them twice as much as anything else in our lives. Dwelling on our sorrows leads to depression. Verse 20, my soul is downcast within me. Downcast means literally to sink or to be weighed down. And that's probably a good description of depression. You are weighed down by all of your troubles, and you just start to sink beneath the load. And once you start sinking, you lose all sight of hope. And so in order to find hope, you must arrive at a turning point. And that's what we find in verse 21. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The author doesn't deny his sufferings. He doesn't minimize them or try to rationalize them in any way. His losses are real and not imagined. He remembers them only too well, but now he makes a choice. He chooses not to dwell on them. He calls to mind or chooses to remember something else instead. And this something else is God's faithfulness. The climax of the whole book of Lamentations actually comes in verse 23. Great is your faithfulness. God is not only faithful, his faithfulness is great. His faithfulness is perfect, infinite, overflowing, far beyond human faithfulness. When we choose to remember God's faithfulness instead of dwelling on our sorrow, we will find hope instead of bitterness and despair. Because God has been faithful in the past, we can trust him with our present and the future as well, because God is faithful. We have strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. God is faithful in his great love for us, and God is faithful in his goodness to us. Verse 22, it is because of the Lord's great love that we are not consumed. Consume means to be absolutely finished, to be at the end. Ever been there? Ever felt like you were at the end of your tether? But because of God's great love, you are not consumed. You are not finished. You are not at the end. Why? For his compassions never fail. Compassion is a beautiful word in Hebrew. It is literally the word for womb. Verse 22 speaks of God's love towards us in terms of the tender, compassionate love that a mother has for her child that she carries in the womb. And this is the part of the breathtaking beauty of our God. his power, his might, his strength, his stern and absolute justice, and yet at the same time his tender and compassionate love for his children. You may feel like you are at the end, but you are not finished, because God is not finished. You can never say, I'm done, I quit, because God is never done, and God will never quit. He is always there for you. You will not fail, because his compassions never fail, and therefore you have hope. Not only do God's compassions never fail, they are renewed for us daily. Verse 23, they are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. God's mercies are fresh and new every morning. God never serves you leftovers. His compassions never grow tired or stale. He has fresh, new, tender love and compassion for you every day of the week. Every new morning is a sign of God's faithfulness and grace. The changing of the days, the changing of the seasons, all testify to God's great faithfulness, mercy and love. Summer and winter, springtime and harvest, all testify to God's faithfulness. God's compassion never fades. They are new every morning. So what do these verses teach us this morning? Dwelling on our sorrow will only increase our sorrow, but choosing to remember God's faithfulness will bring us hope. So be encouraged by this reading from Lamentations. Choose to remember God's faithfulness. God is faithful in his great love for you. His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. God is faithful in his goodness to you. Learn to trust his character, his timing, and his discipline in your life. And then even in the midst of life's most difficult trials, you will find hope in God. Jesus has never failed us in the past, so we have no reason to doubt his faithfulness in the future. Great is your faithfulness, O Lord. Let's pray. God our Father, this reading reminds us that your love for us is great, and that you are faithful forever. Your own hand shaped us and modelled us, and you have watched each breath with tender care. We rejoice that your kindnesses are never exhausted, but are renewed every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Inspire us each day that we may grow in faithfulness and walk humbly with you, our God. Amen.